The grammar of Standard Modern Greek, as spoken in present-day Greece and Cyprus, is basically that of Demotic Greek, but it has also assimilated certain elements of Katharevousa, the archaic, learned variety of Greek imitating classical Greek forms, which used to be the official language of Greece through much of the 19th and 20th centuries. Modern Greek grammar has preserved many features of ancient Greek, but has also undergone changes in a similar direction as many other modern Indo-European languages, from more synthetic to more analytic structures. General characteristics. Syntax. The predominant word order in Greek is SVO, but word order is quite freely variable, with VSO and other orders as frequent alternatives. Within the noun phrase, adjectives precede the noun, while possessors follow it. Alternative constructions involving the opposite order of constituents are possible as a marked option. Greek is a pro-drop language, i.e., subjects are typically not overtly expressed whenever they are inferable from context, whereas the word order of the major elements within the clause is fairly free. Certain grammatical elements attach to the verb as clitics and form a rigidly ordered group together with it. This applies particularly to unstressed object pronouns, negation particles, the tense particle theta alpha, and the subjunctive particle nu alpha. Likewise, possessive pronouns are enclitic to the nouns they modify. Morphology. Greek is a largely synthetic language, although the complexity of the inflectional system has been somewhat reduced in comparison to ancient Greek. There is also a considerable degree of continuity in the morphological system, and Greek still has a somewhat archaic character compared with other Indo-European languages of Europe. Nouns, adjectives and verbs are each divided into several inflectional classes, which have different sets of endings. In the nominals, the ancient inflectional system is well preserved with the exception of the loss of one case, the dative, and the restructuring of several of the inflectional classes. In the verbal system, the loss of synthetic inflectional categories is somewhat greater, and several new analytic constructions have evolved instead. Characteristics of the Bulkan language area. Modern Greek shares several syntactic characteristics with its geographical neighbors with which it forms the so-called Bulkan language area. Among these characteristics are the lack of an infinitive in Greek, verbal complementation in contexts where English would use an infinitive is typically formed with the help of finite verb forms, the merger of the dative and the genitive case. In Greek, indirect objects are expressed partly through genitive forms of nouns or pronouns, and partly through periphrasis consisting of the preposition sigma epsilon and the accusative. The use of a future construction derived from the verb want, a tendency to use preverbal clitic object pronouns redundantly, doubling an object that is also expressed elsewhere in the clause. For example, tau omicron epsilon iota delta alpha tau omicron alpha epsilon tau omicron kappa iota nu eta tau omicron. On the other hand, one prominent feature of the Bulkan language area that Greek does not share is the use of a postposed definite article. The Greek article stands before the noun. Accent. Modern Greek has a stress accent similar to English. The accent is notated with a stroke over the accented vowel and is called omicron she epsilon iota alpha tau omicron nu omicron sigma in Greek. The former term is taken from one of the accents used in polytonic orthography which officially became obsolete in 1982. Most monosyllabic words take no accent such as in tau omicron and pi omicron iota omicron sigma. Exceptions include the conjunction eta, the interrogative adverbs pi omega sigma and pi omicron epsilon in both direct and indirect questions, and some fixed expressions such as pi omicron upsilon kappa alpha iota pi omicron upsilon and pi omega sigma kappa alpha iota pi omega sigma. Moreover, weak personal pronouns are accented in cases where they may be mistaken for enclitics. For example, omicron sigma kappa upsilon lambda omicron sigma mu omicron upsilon gamma alpha beta gamma iota sigma epsilon instead of omicron sigma kappa upsilon lambda omicron sigma mu omicron upsilon gamma alpha beta gamma iota sigma epsilon. Enclitics are pronounced very closely to the previous word. Most enclitics are weak personal pronouns. Enclitics do not modify the accent of the previous word when this word is accented on the ultimate or penultimate syllable. For example, omicron delta eta gamma omicron sigma mu alpha sigma and beta iota beta lambda iota omicron sigma omicron upsilon. However, when the previous word is accented on the antepenultimate syllable, the enclitic causes the ultimate syllable to be accented too. For example, delta alpha sigma kappa alpha lambda omicron sigma but delta alpha sigma kappa alpha lambda omicron sigma mu omicron epsilon and phi omicron rho epsilon sigma epsilon but phi omicron rho epsilon sigma epsilon tau omicron. Finally, enclitics are accented only when they precede another enclitic, and these two determine an imperative accented on the penultimate syllable. For example, phi epsilon rho epsilon mu omicron epsilon tau omicron. In digraphs which are pronounced as simple phonemes such as alpha iota, omicron iota and epsilon iota, and in the case of alpha upsilon and epsilon upsilon, the accent is placed on the second letter as in alpha iota, epsilon iota, alpha upsilon, etc. When the accent is placed on the first letter, the sequence is pronounced as an accented diphthong, for example alpha iota as in gamma alpha iota delta alpha rho omicron sigma. When the second letter takes a diaresis, the sequence is often pronounced as a diphthong, for example alpha iota as in pi alpha iota delta alpha kappa iota alpha. Finally, when the accent is placed on the second letter together with diaresis, the vowels are pronounced separately and the second vowel is accented, for example alpha iota as in sigma alpha iota tau alpha. As in ancient Greek, in modern Greek the accent cannot be placed before the antepenultimate syllable. As a result, many imparasyllabic nouns, i.e., nouns that do not have the same number of syllables in all their inflections, have the accent placed on the next syllable when a syllable is added, if the antepenult is already accented. For example, nom sg mu alpha theta eta mu alpha but gen sg mu alpha theta eta mu alpha tau omicron sigma and nom place mu alpha theta eta mu alpha tau alpha, etc. However, the transposition of the accent without the addition of a syllable is due to historical reasons. Long vowels and diphthongs occupy two morae, which had the same result as with the addition of a syllable. For example, nom sg alpha nu theta rho omega pi omicron sigma but gen sg alpha nu theta rho omega pi omicron epsilon, gen place alpha nu theta rho omega pi omega nu and acc place alpha nu theta rho omega pi omicron epsilon sigma. Verbs. Greek verb morphology is structured around a basic 2x2 contrast of two aspects, namely imperfective and perfective, and two tenses, namely past and non-past. The aspects are expressed by two separate verb stems, while the tenses are marked mainly by different sets of endings. Of the four possible combinations, only three can be used in indicative function: the present, the imperfect, and the aorist. All four combinations can be used in subjunctive function, where they are typically preceded by the particle nu alpha or by one of a set of subordinating conjunctions. There are also two imperatives, one for each aspect. In addition to these basic forms, Greek also has several periphrastic verb constructions. All the basic forms can be combined with the future particle theta alpha, combined with the non-past forms. This creates an imperfective and a perfective future. Combined with the imperfective past, it is used as a conditional, and with the perfective past as an inferential. There is also a perfect, which is expressed with an inflected form of the auxiliary verb epsilon chi omega. It occurs both as a past perfect and as a present perfect. Modern Greek verbs additionally have three non-finite forms. There is a form traditionally called alpha pi alpha rho epsilon mu phi alpha tau omicron, which is historically derived from the perfective infinitive, but has today lost all syntactical functions typically associated with that category. It is used only to form the periphrastic perfect and pluperfect, and is always formally identical to the third person singular of the perfective non-past. There is also a passive participle, typically ending in menos, which is inflected as a regular adjective. Its use is either as a canonical adjective or as a part of a second, alternative perfect periphrasis with transitive verbs. Finally, there is another invariant form, formed from the present tense and typically ending in ontas, which is variably called either a participle or a gerund by modern authors. It is historically derived from an old present participle, and its sole use today is to form non-finite adjuncted verbial clauses of time or manner, roughly corresponding to an ing participle in English. Regular perfect periphrasis, with a parum fato, for example, epsilon chi omega gamma rho alpha psi epsilon iota tau eta nu epsilon pi iota tau alpha gamma eta. Alternative perfect periphrasis, with passive participle, for example, epsilon chi omega tau eta nu epsilon pi iota tau alpha gamma eta gamma rho alpha mu mu epsilon nu eta. Adverbial clause with present participle, gerund form, for example, epsilon tau rho epsilon she epsilon sigma tau omicron delta rho omicron mu omicron tau rho alpha gamma omicron epsilon delta omega nu tau alpha sigma. The tables below exemplify the range of forms with those of one large inflectional class of verbs. The first conjugation, second conjugation. Below are the corresponding forms of two subtypes of another class, the second conjugation. Only the basic forms are shown here. The periphrastic combinations are formed as shown above, while the person number endings are quite regular across all verbs within each of these classes. The formation of the two basic stems for each verb displays a lot of irregularity and can follow any of a large number of idiosyncratic patterns. Augment the use of the past tense prefix epsilon. The so-called augment shows some variation and irregularity between verb classes. In regular verbs in standard modern Greek, the prefix is used depending on a stress rule, which specifies that each past tense verb form has its stress on the third syllable from the last. The prefix is only inserted whenever the verb would otherwise have fewer than 3 syllables. In these verbs, the augment always appears as epsilon. A number of frequent verbs have irregular forms involving other vowels, mostly eta, for example, theta epsilon lambda omega eta theta epsilon lambda alpha. In addition, verbs from the learned tradition partly preserve more complex patterns inherited from ancient Greek. In learned compound verbs with adverbial prefixes such as pi epsilon rho iota or epsilon pi omicron, the augment is inserted between the prefix and the verb stem. Where the prefix itself ends in a vowel, the vowels in this position may be subject to further assimilation rules, such as in epsilon pi omicron gamma rho alpha phi omega epsilon pi epsilon gamma rho alpha psi alpha. In addition, verbs whose stem begins in a vowel may also display vocalic changes instead of a syllabic augment, as in epsilon lambda pi iota zeta omega eta lambda pi iota zeta alpha. The table below presents some further examples of these patterns. Grammatical voice. Greek is one of the few modern Indo-European languages that still retains a morphological contrast between the two inherited Proto-Indo-European grammatical voices, active and mediopassive. The mediopassive has several functions. Passive function, denoting an action that is performed on the subject by another agent. Reflexive function, denoting an action performed by the subject on him, herself. Reciprocal function, denoting an action performed by several subjects on each other. Modal function, denoting the possibility of an action. Declensional function, verbs that occur only in the mediopassive and lack a corresponding active form. They often have meanings that are rendered as active in other languages. Epsilon rho gamma alpha zeta omicron mu alpha iota work. Kappa omicron iota mu alpha iota I sleep. Delta epsilon chi omicron mu alpha iota I accept. There are also many verbs that have both and active in a mediopassive form, but where the mediopassive has a special function that may be rendered with a separate verb in other languages. For example, active sigma eta kappa omega nu omega I raised. Passive sigma eta kappa omega nu omicron mu alpha iota I get up. Active beta alpha rho alpha omega I strike. Passive beta alpha rho iota epsilon mu alpha iota I am bored. There are also two other categories of verbs, which historically correspond to the ancient contracted verbs. There are also more formal suffixes instead of mu alpha sigma tau alpha nu, sigma alpha tau nu, mu alpha sigma tau epsilon, sigma alpha sigma tau epsilon. In this case the suffixes of the first person of the plural of present and imperfect are the same. Be and have. The verbs epsilon iota mu alpha iota and epsilon chi omega are irregular and defective because they both lack the aspectual contrast. The forms of both are given below. Nouns. The Greek nominal system displays inflection for 2 numbers, 3 genders, and 4 cases. As in many other Indo-European languages, the distribution of grammatical gender across nouns is largely arbitrary and need not coincide with natural sex. Case, number and gender are marked on the noun as well as on articles and adjectives modifying it. While there are 4 cases, there is a great degree of syncretism between case forms within most paradigms. Only one subgroup of the masculine nouns actually has 4 distinct forms in the 4 cases. Articles. There are 2 articles in modern Greek, the definite and the indefinite. They are both inflected for gender and case, and a definite article also for number. The article agrees with the noun it modifies. Definite article. The definite article is used frequently in Greek, such as before proper names and nouns used in an abstract sense. For example, omicron alpha lambda epsilon chi alpha nu delta rho omicron sigma eta rho theta epsilon chi theta epsilon sigma. Eta epsilon iota lambda iota kappa rho iota nu epsilon iota alpha epsilon iota nu alpha iota eta kappa alpha lambda epsilon tau epsilon rho eta pi rho alpha kappa tau iota kappa eta. Indefinite article. The indefinite article is identical with the numeral 1 and has only singular. The use of the indefinite article is not dictated by rules and the speaker can use it according to the circumstances of his speech. Indefiniteness in plural nouns is expressed by the bare noun without an article. For example, alpha gamma omicron rho alpha sigma alpha epsilon nu epsilon pi omicron lambda omicron gamma iota sigma tau eta. However, the indefinite article is not used in Greek as often as in English because it specifically expresses the concept of one. For example, epsilon iota nu alpha iota delta iota kappa eta gamma omicron rho omicron sigma. tau iota kappa alpha lambda omicron pi alpha iota delta iota. Declensions. Greek nouns are inflected by case and number. In addition, each noun belongs to one of three genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. Within each of the three genders, there are several subgroups with different sets of inflectional endings. Masculine nouns. The main groups of masculine nouns have the nominative singular end in omicron sigma, eta sigma, alpha sigma, epsilon alpha sigma. Nouns in OS are identical to the ancient Greek second declension, except for the final n of the accusative singular. However, in other parts of speech that follow the same declension and where clarity is necessary, such as in pronouns, the n is added when the word has more than two syllables and the antepenult is accented. The accent fluctuates between the antepenult and the penult according to whether the last syllable has one of the ancient long diphthongs, omicron upsilon, omega nu or omicron upsilon sigma. Nouns in is correspond to the ancient first declension and have the accent on the ultimate syllable in genitive plural, and so do some nouns ending in iota alpha sigma. Nouns in a stem from the ancient third declension. They formed the nominative singular from the accusative singular and retained the original accent in genitive plural. Nouns in EAS stem from the ancient third declension and formed the plural respectively. Moreover, there are other categories and forms too that have to do either with demotic or Katharevousa. For example, through demotic, many nouns, especially oxytones in alpha sigma or eta sigma, form the plural by adding the stem extension alpha delta and eta delta respectively. Although this declensioned group is an element of demotic, it has its roots in Ionic Greek that influenced lexicon. On the other hand, from Katharevousa, nouns such as mu upsilon sigma follow the ancient declension in all cases except for the dative. Feminine nouns. Most feminine nouns end in eta, alpha and omicron sigma. Those that end in I are many that end in a stem from the ancient first declension and have the accent on the ultimate syllable in genitive plural. The rest of those that end in originate from the ancient third declension and have formed the nominative singular from the ancient accusative singular. Those nouns keep the accent unchanged in genitive plural. The nouns that end in os are identical to the respective masculine nouns. Finally, many feminine nouns that end in eta correspond to ancient Greek nouns in iota sigma. The singular forms have been adapted to the rest of the feminine nouns, while the plural forms have retained the ancient pattern in epsilon iota sigma. The forms of the genitive singular epsilon omega sigma are also found as a stylistic variant, and they are fully acceptable. Neuter nouns. Most neuter nouns end either in omicron or iota. Indeed, most of them that end in I initially ended in io, an ending for diminutives that many nouns acquired already since Con Greek. As a result, the endings of the plural and of the genitive singular are reminiscent of those older forms. For example, the diminutive of the ancient Greek word pi alpha sigma is pi alpha iota delta iota omicron nu, and hence the modern noun pi alpha iota delta iota. Other neuter nouns end in alpha and omicron sigma, and the declension is similar to the ancient one. Moreover, some nouns in iota mu omicron, which are usually derivatives of verbs, are declined similarly to those that end in a. Also note that most borrowings are indeclinable neuter and can have just about any ending, such as gamma omicron upsilon iota nu tau sigma epsilon rho phi iota nu gamma kappa windsurfing. Finally, all neuter nouns have identical forms across the nominative, accusative and vocative. For other neuter nouns, the ancient declension is used. For example, tau omicron phi omega sigma becomes tau omicron upsilon phi omega tau omicron sigma tau alpha phi omega tau alpha alpha and tau omega nu phi omega tau omega nu and tau omicron chi epsilon becomes tau omicron epsilon chi epsilon omicron sigma tau alpha omicron chi epsilon alpha and tau omega nu omicron chi epsilon omega nu. Adjectives. Adjectives agree with nouns in gender, case and number. Therefore, each adjective has a threefold declension paradigm for the three genders. Adjectives show agreement both when they are used as attributes, e.g., eta omicron mu omicron rho phi eta gamma epsilon nu alpha iota kappa alpha, and when they are used as predicates, e.g., eta gamma epsilon nu alpha iota kappa alpha epsilon iota nu alpha iota omicron mu omicron rho phi eta. Most adjectives take forms in omicron sigma in the masculine, omicron in the neuter, and either eta alpha or iota alpha in the feminine. All those adjectives are declined similarly with the nouns that have the same endings. However, they keep the accent stable where nouns change it. Nouns with a consonant before the ending usually form the feminine with eta. Those with a vowel before the ending in alpha, and some nouns that end in kappa omicron sigma or chi omicron sigma usually form it in iota alpha, although the ending eta is applicable. For those two, other classes of adjectives include those that take forms in eta sigma in both masculine and feminine, and in epsilon sigma in neuter. They are declined similarly with the ancient declension. Those that are not accented on the ultima usually raise the accent in the neuter. Another group includes adjectives that end in epsilon sigma, although some are declined somewhat archaically, such as omicron chi epsilon sigma. Most of them are declined according to the rules of Demotic Greek, and in many cases and persons they acquire other endings, such as in the case of pi lambda alpha tau epsilon sigma. The adjective pi omicron lambda epsilon sigma is irregular, comparative and superlative. Adjectives in modern Greek can form a comparative for expressing comparisons. Similar to English, it can be formed in two ways, as a periphrastic form and as a synthetic form using suffixes, as in English adjective tall comp taller. The periphrastic comparative is formed by the particle pi iota omicron preceding the adjective. The synthetic forms of the regular adjectives in omicron sigma, eta and o is created with the suffix omicron tau epsilon rho omicron sigma, omicron tau epsilon rho eta and omicron tau epsilon rho omicron. For those adjectives that end in eta sigma and epsilon sigma, or epsilon sigma, epsilon iota alpha and epsilon, the corresponding suffixes are epsilon sigma tau epsilon rho omicron sigma etc. and epsilon tau epsilon rho omicron sigma etc., respectively. A superlative is expressed by combining the comparative in either its periphrastic or synthetic form with a preceding definite article. Thus, modern Greek does not distinguish between the largest house and the larger house. Both the tau omicron mu epsilon gamma alpha lambda epsilon tau epsilon rho omicron sigma pi iota tau iota. Besides the superlative proper, sometimes called relative superlative, there is also an absolute superlative or elative, expressing the meaning very. For example, omega rho alpha iota omicron tau alpha tau omicron sigma means very beautiful. Elatives are formed with the suffixes omicron tau alpha tau omicron sigma, omicron tau alpha tau eta and omicron tau alpha tau omicron. For the regular adjectives epsilon sigma tau alpha tau omicron sigma etc. For those in eta sigma and epsilon tau alpha tau omicron sigma. For those in epsilon sigma. Numerals. The numerals 1, 3 and 4 are declined irregularly. Other numerals such as delta, iota, alpha, kappa, omicron, sigma, iota, omicron, iota, tau, rho, iota, alpha, kappa, omicron, sigma, iota, omicron, iota, etc., and chi, iota, lambda, iota, omicron, iota are declined regularly like adjectives. Other numerals including two are not declined. Pronouns. Greek pronouns include personal pronouns, reflexive pronouns, demonstrative pronouns, interrogative pronouns, possessive pronouns, intensive pronouns, relative pronouns, and indefinite pronouns. Personal pronouns. There are strong personal pronouns and weak personal pronouns. Nominative pronouns only have the strong form and are used as subjects only when special emphasis is intended. Since unstressed subjects recoverable from context are not overtly expressed anyway, genitive pronouns are used in the weak forms as preverbal clitics to express indirect objects, and as a post-nominal clitic to express possession. The strong genitive forms are relatively rare and used only for special emphasis. Often they are doubled by the weak forms. An alternative way of giving emphasis to a possessive pronoun is propping it up with the stressed adjective delta, iota, kappa, omicron, sigma. For example, omicron, iota, delta, iota, kappa, omicron, iota, tau, omicron, upsilon, phi, iota, lambda, omicron, iota. Accusative pronouns exist both in a weak and a strong form. The weak form is used as a preverbal clitic. The strong form is used elsewhere in the clause. Third-person pronouns have separate forms from the three genders. Those of the first and second person do not. The weak third-person forms are similar to the corresponding forms of the definite article. The strong third-person forms function simultaneously as generic demonstratives. The strong plural forms of the third person in the genitive and accusative have optional alternative forms extended by an additional syllable or. Besides alpha, upsilon, tau, omicron, sigma as a generic demonstrative, there are also the more specific spatial demonstrative pronouns tau, omicron, upsilon, tau, omicron, sigma, eta, omicron, and epsilon, kappa, epsilon, iota, nu, omicron, sigma, eta, omicron. Prepositions. In Demotic Greek, prepositions normally require the accusative case alpha, pi, omicron, gamma, iota, alpha, mu, epsilon, tau, alpha, chi, omega, rho, iota, sigma, omega, sigma, and sigma, epsilon. The preposition sigma epsilon, when followed by a definite article, fuses with it into forms like sigma tau omicron and sigma tau eta. While there is only a relatively small number of simple prepositions native to Demotic, the two most basic prepositions sigma epsilon and alpha pi omicron can enter into a large number of combinations with preceding adverbs to form new compound prepositions. For example, pi alpha nu omega sigma epsilon, kappa alpha tau omega alpha pi omicron, pi lambda alpha iota sigma epsilon, etc. A few prepositions that take cases other than the accusative have been borrowed into standard modern Greek from the learned tradition of Katharevousa, kappa alpha tau alpha upsilon pi epsilon rho alpha nu tau iota. Other prepositions live on in a fossilized form in certain fixed expressions. The preposition alpha pi omicron is also used to express the agent in passive sentences, like English by. Conjunctions. Coordinating and subordinating conjunctions in Greek include. The word nu alpha serves as a generic subordinator corresponding roughly to English to that in sentences like pi rho omicron tau iota mu omega nu alpha omega pi rho omicron tau iota mu omega nu alpha pi alpha epsilon iota omicron gamma iota alpha nu eta sigma. It marks the following verb as being in the subjunctive mood. Somewhat similar to the English to infinitive, its use is often associated with meanings of non-factuality, e. events that have not come true, that are expected, wished for, etc. In this, it contrasts with omicron, tau, iota and pi, omega, sigma, which correspond to English that when used with the meaning of factuality. The difference can be seen in the contrast between mu alpha sigma epsilon iota pi epsilon nu alpha pi alpha mu epsilon beta omicron lambda tau alpha versus mu alpha sigma epsilon iota pi epsilon pi omega sigma pi eta gamma epsilon beta omicron lambda tau alpha. When used on its own with the following verb, nu alpha may express a wish or order, as in nu alpha pi alpha epsilon iota. Unlike the other subordinating conjunctions, nu alpha is always immediately followed by the verb it governs, separated from it only by any clitics that might be attached to the verb, but not by a subject or other clause initial material.